Professor Peter Stratton, Professor Emeritus.
Yes.
Peter, known as Peter, to the systemic community and the wider research community, therapy community. Peter, it's a great honor to have this time to talk with you today. Thank you for joining Systemic Lives conversation. I know you through KCC London, when it was in existence, the Systemic Therapy and Research Training Institute, but I also know you through the Leeds Family Therapy and Research Institute at the University of Leeds, where you were part of a team where you were spearheading the setting up of systemic therapy trainings and doing systemic therapy research. There's a lot more in your bag. And I'm going to just embarrass you for a moment and tell our listeners, viewers, that in my opinion, Peter and a small team of others pretty much single-handedly saved the systemic therapy profession from disappearing off the map when evidence-based practice was surging inwards as a key criteria that authorized the rolling out of different therapies. And systemic therapy, it didn't have an evidence base. And Peter ran around creating inventories, tools, questionnaires, aka SCORE, that many people will know, to provide that evidence base. And there we were. That the rest is history, and we're sailing. And I think that's a really important thing that I wanted to just throw in as a marker. It was a real act of love and care for the community, that piece of work. So now that I just acknowledged that, welcome, Peter. Can I do a very lineal thing, a very uncircular thing, and start at the beginning and assume there's a beginning? Assume there's a beginning. Is that all right?
Yes. Yeah, it makes sense.
And then you can also introduce other parts of you, your different working lives and selves and identities and communities as we go along.
Yeah, my research career started at the beginning. I spent 5 years researching babies up to the age of 5 days. So that's the beginning.
What was the main research question you were preoccupied with at that point? Because I'm going to turn it round if I can, but ask about you in a moment, baby.
Okay. The major parenting book, Penelope Leach, still exists. At that time said, don't bother trying to get to know your baby in the first 8 weeks because they're not fully human yet. And there is something that happens at 8 weeks in the brain. I thought we had a baby by then. It was nonsense.
Wow.
So a lot of the point of the research was showing the capabilities that babies have got. So formally, a lot of it was simple learning, habituation. But, well, I'll jump. We discovered that babies could judge time intervals. So we would make a noise every 30 seconds. And when at the end of half an hour it didn't come, they jumped. So they were expecting it, anticipating it at the interval that they got used to, and things like that.
Peter, let's talk about you as a baby, though. What were you like as a baby, and how do you think, what sort of do you think your parents' ethos was? What were they reading at the time that influenced their parenting style?
I was born in 1940, so my first 5 years were taken up with the war, really. I was in London and have fragmentary memories about bombs. Nothing problematic. the main memory I've got is that if you woke up in the night hearing bombs, you could cry and be carried down to the shelter in the living room. And the one I remember most is the night when it was a strange bomb and my sister got carried down, but I didn't realize it was a bomb, so I didn't pretend to cry and didn't get carried down. And what that meant was the next day she could play in the shelter because her bedding was there and I couldn't. That's an early trauma. But there were obviously the war influenced considerably and the austerity afterwards.
Which part of London was that?
In North London, around Southgate. But Helga Hanks, my wife, grew up in Berlin being bombed by the British while I was in London being bombed by the Germans. So we've got that in common.
Yeah, talk about things in common. What did your parents do during that period? Were they working? How were they part of the war effort and all the rest of it?
Yeah. They were a very traditional nuclear family. So when they got married, my mother stopped working. She'd been in a secretary in the factory where Dad worked. And he was working his way up. The company was Harris Liebus in Tottenham, a very big furniture factory. And in the war, it was making the wooden frames for canoes and some of the frames for aircraft. So he was exempt from national service and was a fire warden locally. So he was around, in other words. And the factory, another anecdote from that time, but I remember he once came home and said there was an incendiary bomb that hit the factory. And Mum said, actually, we had 3 hit houses in our road, in one that hit our house, but it bounced off the roof and landed in the garden, and the locals covered it up with earth. But
Wow.
An incendiary bomb in a furniture factory of glue and wood was very serious business. So those things were around. But he had a big axe as part of his fire warden duty. So I was very impressed with that, I remember. So I do remember things from those times.
What kind of child were you, Peter?
Fairly stroppy. As a family, now I should admit, I've seen your questions and been actually thinking about them ever since. We were a fairly uncommunicative family. And I think I grew up not communicating. I could always claim to be on the spectrum or something to justify that, but I was quite private, lived in my head quite a lot. And about the home, I don't remember books in the home particularly, except one disastrous one, Straw Peter, that is a different story. But in my adolescence, I was obsessively reading. I'd cycle down to Edmonton Library with the 6 books I'd read that week and collected another 6 books to read for the subsequent week.
What was it about books?
Real life. I just read. I found it fascinating. I read a very wide range of stuff, from Biggles through to Chinese philosophy. In fact, I've just I don't know whether it was triggered by this, but I read quite a lot of the French novelists in translation. I failed O-level French 3 times, I think. And there was one by Mauriac called The Knot of Vipers, an everyday story of family life. And I started wondering, had that influenced my understanding of families? So I just bought it on World Books, but I haven't got around to reading it again yet.
Oh, that'll be fascinating to consider. And just jumping back, I'm trying to imagine or visualize what Edmonton Library looked like. What sort of building was it in those days? Or is it still the same building, I wonder?
It could be, I don't really have an image of the building. I would cycle down there and walk through the entrance, and it was racks of books for a traditional library.
It was the inside that mattered. Yes. What wondrous places libraries are for a lot of people, or have been, in terms of all the possibilities of things that one could pick off the shelves. Did your parents read?
Mum read Woman's Own and the equivalents at the time, and the Daily Telegraph. Dad read. I'm sure they must have read books, but at one point, Mum said she wanted to know the kind of modern writing. I think they had an idea of books as Victorian story. And I was reading Portnoy's Complaint at the time. I don't know whether anybody remembers that, but it was actually it was an interesting book. But Portnoy, it was the story of him and his father. His complaint was compulsive masturbation. His father's was constipation. And I never worked out whether Portnoy's complaint was his father's or his own problem. So I mentioned this to my mother, but I don't think she ever read it. I hope she didn't. It was very inappropriate as an introduction to modern literature. It was what I had to be reading at the time.
What was the community culture like? Were there books around in the community? What were the riches of community that were around for your family, for you, if any? Or was it a more fragmented post-war society where people just needed to get on with life?
Yeah, there wasn't an enormous community of neighbours. We moved when I was 10, so into a completely different, fairly different area, and then they moved again when I was 20. But by then I was at university anyway. Also, I'd gone to the Catholic grammar in Finchley, so but by then we were down in Enfield, so that was quite a commute.
What was the change in schools like between primary and secondary school for you? Like,
well, the primary school was a feeder. It was on the same campus as the grammar school, and the main difference. It was dreadful, the primary school. I don't think any of the teachers were trained, but there was a lot of caning. I think I became a nuisance. I know I found school reports recently, just the first ones. After the first term, I came top of the class in maths. After the second term, I came bottom of the class in maths, and the teacher has no ability in this subject. Clearly hadn't looked at the previous page. I think I discovered it was more fun being a nuisance. And I think it was probably fairly disruptive all through my schooling. So I got caned all the time.
Oh.
But one of the downsides of it was there was only one person in my year from primary school on who lived anywhere close, because the school was over in North Finchley, Margaret Thatcher's constituency, though it wasn't at the time. So
No. So
I had a bike, got around, and so on.
the bike must have been a really lovely and important thing, sense of freedom as well as some duress involved, getting about because you had to during rain and horrible weather. Did you have any siblings? You mentioned your sister.
Yeah.
Now, what was your relationship with your sister like, or were there other siblings as well?
Yeah. There were four of us. And so I was between two sisters. Pat was about 2 years older and Jill 3 years younger. And it was slightly competitive, but basically we got on. But we had different interests. And anyway, they were girls. Finchley Grammar was a boys' school. So they were the only girls I knew, really, for quite a long time. And yeah, life, family life was peaceful, trundled along. There were other things that come to mind. There was a guy next door, slightly older than me, and it's terrible to think of it now, but we had a competition of stringing together rubber bands to see how far we could fire a metal, a staple. So we actually launched them into the houses a very long way away. Thank God we never hit anybody in the eye with them. Not terribly socially conscious at the time.
Sounds like a sort of scientific experiment that you were young engineers trying to be very scientific and experimental and collaborative.
That's with positive connotation, yeah.
And presumably we're talking about late 40s, early 50s, something like that.
Early 50s, yes. Shall I tell you my first experiment, which came to mind?
Oh, please do. Yes.
About this. Around the age of 5, I collected various biological materials, put them in a glass pot, filled it with water, and put it in the sunshine to see what would happen. My analyst, who knew the history a bit, the dates, said I was trying to make a baby. And I think about it, damn it, he was right. Because my sister had been born recently, and I was trying to make something come to life. So that's the first experiment I remember doing.
It's a very interesting question about, there are these different schools, in particular psychoanalysis. Well, of course, there are many schools of psychoanalysis. There's the school or the approach set of values where analysts interpret on behalf of the patient, and then those who ask the patient, what do you make of this? And I guess systemic is more the collaborative meaning making rather than the interpretive.
Yeah.
And of course, sometimes other people's interpretations have enormous resonance for us. But I wonder how you'd have been affected if it had been somebody who said, "What do you think of your creative abilities?" Or "How did you develop that level of curiosity?" Or "Where did the curiosity come from?" That sort of experimental part of you. Because that
Mm.
experimental part of you sounds like it was very active, that you were a very
Yeah.
curious young person.
Mm. But that goes back to the reading. I think the
Mm.
curiosity got into exploring everything I could lay my hands on to read.
What did your parents make of you doing that much reading? Did they know what was going on? Did they realize you were reading a lot?
Oh yes, I I think basically, I mean, Dad had hoped I would be um, sporty and athletic and so on, but being somewhat dyspraxic, I definitely wasn't. Um, the school had a system, they tested you for football ability at the age of 11 when you joined, and if you weren't already good, you got sent off down the end of the field to mess about. Uh, so didn't get any training anyway, but I wouldn't have ever been any good at that. Yeah,
Who?
God, I remember Dad. I mean, had wanted to be a boxer, I think. So he bought me boxing gloves
Mm.
when I was young, and then he would kneel on the floor and ask me to try and hit him, and I just couldn't bring myself to. Um, so
What did you do instead?
uh,
What did you do then?
I can't do it. Uh,
Oh,
so
how?
wasted money on the boxing gloves.
Um, uh, who were the people in your life who recognized your mental agility?
Uh, I think people did, but teachers, I suppose. But that also was, I mean, I found school excruciatingly boring, most of the lessons. The English guy was very good, and he picked up on something. And the maths teacher was actually wonderful because he'd been, I don't know if he had any training, but he'd been teaching geography, and then they got a qualified geography teacher. So they moved him on to teaching maths. So maths consisted us sitting in the class with old exam questions and jointly struggling together to answer them. And
Mm.
that really worked for me. Oh, and Doc Ward, who a priest, a canon, who taught us medieval logic, and that was fascinating. He was a really good teacher.
Sounds like you really loved those intellectual challenges and the sense of uh, team exploration, working together to tease out a problem, logic or maths or whatever.
In class one day, there was a teacher who was a bit prone to violence, who was giving us a letter to take to our parents, and he was going around the class giving it to each of us in turn and explaining to each of us how important it was that we delivered the letter. Uh, and it was boring. So when he got to the far corner of the classroom, I took a sheet of paper out of my desk and tore it in half. I've never heard such a loud noise in my life, actually. And he spun round as if he'd been shot. So I folded the piece of paper up, put it back in the desk, and started reading his letter. And he had to decide whether to come all the way around the class and kill me, or whether that would lose him too much status. So he just carried on saying, "Here is a letter." Um,
It,
and I know one of your questions, so I'm trying to get down your list because one of your questions is my first job. And
yes, but I am interested, and maybe we'll come on to this. I'm interested in something about your not wanting to take things at face value, not wanting to just fit in and be passive, whether it's in class or in judo or whatever it is, that there's something about a part of you that can read the situation, and you make decisions, sometimes to not react and sometimes to act, sometimes with a degree of irony. And I think you are known as somebody with a wry humor, an ability to comment on things with an edge of, I would call it observational humor, something like that. Um, and I'm just sort of interested in that, and maybe we'll come on to it in terms of how that's played a part in your professional contributions as well. Because I think that kind of ability to respond, to read the situation, and not buy into it wholesale just for a peaceful life, to make a mark, to make a sound, to be not so much a nuisance, but make new sense, is perhaps part of what marks out some of your contributions in the systemic field. Tell us about your new job, your first job, not your new job, your first job. What was your first job then?
Irreverence really appealed to me when Gianfranco started talking about it. But anyway, my first job was.
But when you say appeal to you, I think probably what you mean, it had resonance for you. It sort of maybe authorized something that was, as it were, already there for you and in play, and gave it some validity. Well, there's me interpreting. There we go.
Okay, so I was thinking about my first job, apart from a paper round, which was in a little woods factory when I was 15 during the summer holiday. And there was a rather fearsome Irish foreman who was in charge of us. And one of the things was I tried out the kind of wit that I cultivated to push things to the limit with the school teachers, to annoy them, because they deserved it mostly. And I got a look from him that just instantly realized that in the real world, you don't do the kind of stuff you can get away with school teachers.
Bill, what did you do then?
I just didn't do anything like that again with him. I didn't apologize, but I just didn't try it on with him. As I say, he was pretty fearsome, but the job was a lift would come up full of sacks of parcels. We had to unload them, stack them, get the bags back in the lift, and then wait for the next one. We were in between lifts, sitting on the window ledge, and a young man in a suit came past and said, "Why are we paying these people to sit around doing nothing?" And this foreman just said, "When the lift comes up," he was Irish, "you'll see the sweat running down their arseholes." And the suit left the scene very hurriedly. So the foreman protected us, and then quietly said, "Probably a good thing not to sit down in between times. It doesn't look good." So it was 5 weeks in this summer job, but it was real life in a way that I wasn't really experiencing anywhere else.
What happened then? How did you get from there to? Did you go to university? Did you go to college? What happened after that?
I then had I worked for Victoria Wine, a wine chain, for a long time, and drove vans as soon as I qualified, as soon as I passed my driving test, which was 2 months after my 17th birthday. So that was a real promotion. So did a whole lot of things like that. But from school, I went to Leicester University, and there wasn't a system, there was no UCAS or anything. I'd not managed to get in. The school tried to get us into Oxford and Cambridge. That was the only thing they were interested in, and I didn't manage that. So, and then a friend phoned saying, I've just got into Leicester. It's dead easy. Just phone them up. So I phoned them up and they said, and I had a good maths A levels, very good, and physics. And so they said, yeah, come. And I had to find Leicester on the map. I'd failed O-level geography. I don't have a memory, by the way. This accounts for quite a lot of my academic career, why I couldn't learn French. So I had trouble finding Leicester on the map, but eventually I did, and went up there and started doing a maths degree.
So you started maths and then?
Leicester had a good system where you could mix different subjects. So I did logic and theory of knowledge. I missed out. Rom Harry was there teaching logic and scientific method. And I thought I was doing enough science. I wanted to do theory of knowledge. So I didn't go to Rom Harry's lectures.
What a near miss. But Peter, I mean, it always strikes me that young people going to university, I can understand them choosing subjects that are familiar to those they did in school, similar to. But to do theory of knowledge, how old were you? What did that even mean to you?
I was 18. Well, I'd been reading philosophy books. And those, I mean, the two, philosophy of science and theory of knowledge were two options that were available. And that sounded, when I looked into it, quite good. I did in the final year do psychology, but the sociology department, two heavyweights, Norbert Elias and Neustadt, were running sociology and were blocking the university creating a psychology department.
That's interesting, because I'd have thought, I mean, firstly, what are we talking about here? Which year?
19, yeah. Well, I finished there in 62.
So at that time, I'd have thought psychology would have had more power than sociology. So I'm kind of interested in that. It often later on was psychology blocking sociology. But what did that do? What did that mean for you then?
Those two.
I
But
see.
eventually they allowed psychology, so long as it was biological psychology.
So what did you do?
Well, but they did allow a year, but I was tutored by a very trendy young man. Can I remember his name? He became head of LSE. Got very famous sociologist, but as a postgraduate, they put him to teaching psychology.
But presumably his bias would have been more social psychology than biological psychology, wouldn't it?
Oh, yes, I suppose. But anyway, so I did that. And then when I graduated, and I think, to be honest, I'd probably got firsts in the philosophy and psychology and fails in the maths. There were all kinds of things about that, including actually starting 2 or 3 weeks late and not having the introductions to the courses. But anyway, I didn't go and ask. So that was characteristic, I think, of me.
You didn't ask. What was that about? That you didn't ask because you didn't feel entitled? You didn't have the confidence? You weren't interested?
I don't ask.
Okay.
I get still hassle from Helga that I'll try and work things out. She'll say, why not just phone them up and ask them? And then I do, but it doesn't come first on my list of things. So that's me. Getting to relevant stuff, while I was in the library supposed to be doing maths, I encountered the Hickson Symposia on cybernetics, the one that Bateson and various others had contributed to, and got very interested in cybernetics. And I was also doing a philosophy subsidiary and wrote essays on. There was an article, one of the chapters in the Hickson was Why the Mind is in the Head, and talking about brain function and cybernetics and systems. And that was much more exciting. So anyway, when I kind of graduated with my 2-2, I then signed up at Birkbeck to do a psychology degree. And that was my first proper job. I taught in the secondary modern in Wilston. Pretty tough. And
what did you teach?
I was employed for maths because they couldn't get a maths teacher, and the main maths teacher was a severe alcoholic, so he was just not there a lot of the time. But I had no training of any kind. I could do the maths up to O level fairly well, but then I was kind of a bit surplus, so I got to teach French and history and swimming and cricket even. It was riot control really rather than teaching. I was a terrible teacher, actually, but also I was commuting on a moped from Enfield to Willesden, and then from there into Birkbeck, because all the lectures were in the evening in Birkbeck. That's why I could do it. And then back to Enfield.
That's a lot of moped miles.
Pretty exhausted with the evenings. I remember waking up once. I was always sitting in the back row with a shout because I'd been fast asleep in a lecture. And I suddenly went, as one sometimes does. And I tried the thing of looking behind me so it was someone else, but there's just a wall behind me. I went and apologized to the lecturer who said, yeah, we know you spend most of our lectures asleep. But one of them, Kevin Connolly, bless him, teaching developmental, was moving from Birkbeck up to Sheffield and said, come and do a PhD on babies.
Oh, wow. What an invitation.
Yeah, so I did, of course.
So what do you think he saw, this Kevin Connolly?
I think, actually, we knew him fairly well, partly as he was a Catholic. I was by then married in my third year, and we. Did we know him that well? I don't know. And I did stop going to his lectures because I thought they were boring. I think he reckoned I had good judgment or something. But anyway, he saw something and suggested this. Actually, I had a job immediately after graduating with Unilever in their market research department. Brian Foss, one of the lecturers, set me up for that to do a project on eye movement detection. Anyway, that's also an irrelevance, really.
Well, it's just a sort of another little anecdote of how you got your education and we're using applied theory or or involvement in research. There've been a lot of different things you've done.
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole theme there. We jumping a lot to 1990, we set up a business. We developed a research technique in family therapy of analysing people's causal beliefs, and we set up a business to take that along with systemic consultation out to business. And we ran that for 10 years as a sideline while I was a lecturer at Leeds University. I did actually buy myself out part-time to run the business and bring in research money. But that's ahead.
Okay, so how would you summarize your early career, and how did that shift? What was the next phase?
So I did the PhD in Sheffield and 2 years as a research assistant. By then I had 2 children and the third one just coming. So I moved up the age range. So I had options really of being either a physiological psychologist or a developmentalist, given the PhD. So I went for developmental and started trying to do observational studies of young children. I got intrigued by curiosity was a big thing actually at the time in psychology. And I was intrigued that 18-month-olds are fun, exploratory, curious. And by the age of 3, quite a few of them have lost that. And I wanted to try and study that.
Study what? The shift from being curious into lack of?
Really what was going on in the family so that some of them maintained that and others lost it.
Was that an age group who were not yet attending nursery?
Yeah, that's right.
Because a lot of people think that kids go to nursery from a very early age, but that's a more recent development in the last few decades, isn't it?
Yeah, there wasn't any of that. Though one of the research projects we did was on children whose mothers had been convicted of abuse, but the children were still with the mothers. And quite a few of these mothers were doing childminding for other mothers with children. So yeah, in that project, I was looking at, by then, that was in the 70s, getting quite interested in child abuse and realizing what I was doing was going into the home with a camera and some toys and trying to suss what was going on. But of course, I realized I wasn't seeing family life the way it was. Really, and I wasn't getting anything useful. And at the same time, I was becoming very well aware of abuse, which was at that time denied. And that in the latter half, I was getting together with Helga, who was also, as a clinical psychologist, trying to work with child abuse. It kind of came together that if we saw families in therapy, they would have an investment in working with us to all understand what was going on in the family. And that's really where the impetus to set up a family therapy clinic came from. It didn't come from an enthusiasm for systemics. I rediscovered systemics once we started doing family therapy. Well, we started with Minuchin and boundaries and things like that.
But this is the two really important and interesting things that I just want to emphasize here. One is that child abuse existed, but it wasn't acknowledged to exist almost prior to, what would you say, somewhere in the 70s.
Even then it was fought.
It was fought. It wasn't. I remember, qualifying as a social worker in 1980. So my training had been a bit earlier, and it wasn't really on the map very much. There were some courses. I remember doing a course in the early 80s with the Open University on child abuse, but there was no child sexual abuse. That only came in. This
Yeah.
sounds mad, doesn't it? But that only came in later in the early mid 80s.
Yeah.
Well, mid 80s, really.
Hacked, produced by the Open University, very much ahead of its time. I think it
Yes.
was maybe 1967 or something they
Oh, wow.
created, with games to play with social workers to get them aware. Brilliant stuff. But yes, when the Butler Sloss report into the child abuse, it was a couple of pediatricians that Helga had worked with, and she was in the inquiry. When that report came out, I bought every national newspaper for the entire week. The report came out on a Wednesday, and I can do obsessional when I need to.
I was
So
going to say you have some kind of memory as well.
especially for the older part of this discussion will be much longer than the more recent one, because I can remember I'm doing my age appropriate thing of remembering the remote past better than recent. But we recorded, measured the column inches of reporting of abuse in the newspapers in the 3 days before the Butler Sloss report came out, which said, yes, it is sexual abuse. That is what was happening. And the 3 days after. And it didn't change. There was a bit more reporting, but it was just as much in denial in the newspapers as it had been before Butler Sloss said,
Wow.
yes, it is sexual abuse. It was so embedded, it didn't change.
That's really, firstly, it's a fascinating experiment. Secondly, it's a shocking finding. But the other thing I was going to draw attention back to, the second point, was how interesting that you set up a team because you found that working with families where there'd been abuse seemed to work. The idea that people would want to talk together to make sense. That sort of reminds me a little bit of Imelda McCarthy's work in Dublin with Nolig Byrne and Phil Carney as well, and their Fifth Province work. But so what happened in the shift? How did you get from talking with families where there'd been some kind of abuse towards the children taking place and falling into or meeting family therapy, systemic ideas, whatever they were called at the time?
There were a group, mostly clinical psychologists, with Helga, who also wanted to start working with families. That hadn't been part of the training or anything, but they all recognized the need to work with whole families somehow. I had two rooms in a little end of terrace that belonged to the psychology department, and I had a 1 foot square window because I was trying to do a version of Ainsworth's Strange Situation.
What do you mean you had the window was there already?
Yes, was there already, actually. And so I would use it to observe through mothers. And
So this is the work of Mary Ainsworth, who was
yes,
one of the early contributors to particularly the English school of psychoanalysis, interested in mother-baby relationships. Is that right? And infant observation.
He developed a whole she worked with Bowlby and developed. She actually did field work in Africa and developed a whole theory of infant attachment. She was one of the main movers back in America once she went back.
Did she do the milestones? Did she do the sort of developmental milestones, or was that somebody else?
She did the Strange Situation, where she had a whole where the mother and child are in a situation. The mother moves out, and the child is on their own for a while. And then when the mother comes back, they analyze how the child reacts to the mother. And out of that, she developed either the secure attachment, insecure attachment, or dissociated. So, and she did it. It's a nice research technique. She did observational descriptions of how the children reacted. And some of them ignore the mother crossly when she comes back, and others are very clinging and so on. She grouped them into 3 groups, spread them out on her living room floor, and coalesced them into this theory about attachment. So actually, one of my things was I wanted to do it with 2-year-olds for a particular reason. Applied for a research grant, and the referee said this has never been done before, so it shouldn't be funded. For a research
hilarious.
as a criterion. However, I was never very good at writing research.
Okay, so you had the Ainsworth window, a little
yes.
box window, and then what happened? Then back to the development of family.
I had video equipment, so we sat actually on the other side of it. Turned my office over into the consulting room, and we took it in turns to peer through the window. And we had audio. Then I got a camera so we could have it on screen, and then it just seemed silly. So one weekend, I came in with a postgrad with a sledgehammer, and we knocked out a big hole in the wall between the 2 rooms, and bought some double glazing from Homebase and installed that in the hole in the wall. The university was very strict about you weren't allowed to change anything in the buildings without using estate's office, who were very slow and charged a fortune. So we just did it quietly.
Quietly, did you muffle the sledgehammer?
Well, there was nobody else in the building. It was sadly. So we had a decent-sized one-way screen. Building.
This is one of those stories of can-do, meeting needs, off the radar, in order to develop practice, in order to offer a service. So what happened next then?
Well, what happened? One of the things that happened is that Dorothy Hurd, who'd worked with Bowlby, came up to Leeds because her husband, the analyst, came up and joined our family therapy team, and then involved us with Bowlby. So one of the things that happened was we went down to Bowlby's seminars actually in John Byng Hall's house for quite a lot, and we were trying to develop research around attachment. But the other thing is, Dorothy somehow had a contact with Peter Lang.
I was wondering.
Who was a vicar in Kensington at the time. And really a major event. Peter and Martin ran conferences in Oxford, and in, I think it was 82, maybe 83, they had a conference or a meeting for advanced family therapy teams, and we got invited to that. There's no way we were an advanced family therapy team, but it is typical of Peter, actually, to have this. So we went down, and Luigi and Gianfranco were there, and Brian Cade, and all kinds of people. And that was amazing and an eye-opener. And that was really when we got systemics properly under our belt from that early interaction with Casey.
It must have been really exciting to realize there was a community that had a lot of interesting intellectual ideas that were being made with each other, shared, elaborated on, and so on.
Yeah. Yes, because I think everything we'd been reading was American. at that
Of
stage.
course. And then suddenly this European,
Yeah, well,
English, Italian, and so on.
yes, yeah. So, and that put us in touch with Barnett Pearce, and coordinated management of meaning was, and so on. Now, is it possible to pause this recording for a
It
minute?
definitely is. Okay, we're back. You know,
Okay.
Peter, you've been talking about a really interesting era now of the, what is it? Birth of, explosion of, making of that of family therapy, and particularly a kind of, let's call it the new systemic era, because there was something that, or maybe just the birth of a systemic era, because there was something that happened in those get-togethers that meant people could come from wherever in the world, meet, talk, exchange knowledge about practice and theory, and then go back into their own environments and often invite people into their own environments. So, you meeting Peter Lang, of course, I think he was a supervisee of Bowlby. And
It was.
yeah.
They
And
fought.
so, yeah, so very interesting stories there. But in terms of you meeting him through Dorothy Hurd and the psychoanalytic influence, there were so many people interested in family therapy. And then you have the breakaways from psychoanalysis in some respects, or elaborators on, in terms of Gianfranco Cecchine and Luigi Boscolo, and their rejection of the focus on the individual. And then you have Peter Lang and Martin Little, also struggling with this story of the individual in isolation as the site for treatment. So there was this kind of circus, in a very respectful way, I mean this, of animation, of ideas, of interactive processes. So carry on telling the story a bit about what happened in the forming and influences of the Leeds Family Therapy Research Centre.
But for my story, I need to go back a decade.
Okay.
Um, I had been really interested in cybernetics, on brain function, computer simulation, and that was big when I was doing my Birkbeck psychology degree in the late 60s. No, sorry, the early 60s, 62 to 65. When I went to do the PhD, I lost track of that. So I never discovered pragmatics when it was published in 67, for example. But I had a decade where I was very interested in computer simulation of the brain, which was a big topic. And that
Are we
was, again,
talking? Are we talking
this was
AI,
in,
the early artificial intelligence?
yeah, but it was pretty hypothetical because the computers were extremely primitive. The Sheffield University computer was this vast building with a 1K memory, because it was 1,000 valves with all their refrigeration equipment to keep it cool so that it didn't burn out very often. So, computers were unwieldy. And the story was, if you built a computer to simulate the brain, you wouldn't fit it into the Albert Hall, I remember being said. That was before transistors were invented. I go back a long way. So I
But it's
had a
also a short.
decade
But it's
of
also a short.
system.
It's. So I was just going to say, it's also actually quite a short period of time. It might be a significant period of time going back to then, but we're talking decades in terms
Yeah.
of how quickly things have developed in the world. So the year of this massive computer and the research you were involved in, or the studies you were involved in, was, what did you say, early 70s?
All through the 70s. There was
Yes.
an organization called Brain Research Association, which was trying to understand the brain, which I was interested in, but also about simulating brain functions in computers. But it was as a theoretical discussion, but it was a way of getting to grips with and with mind, not just brain. So when I came, the point of that is when I came to systemics in family work, I actually had a 20-year interest in systems and cybernetics
Okay.
from other angles. Well, not entirely other angles, because I had been reading Bates and in the Hickson Symposium, which had been written in the 50s. Yeah, roundabout. So anyway, so when we discovered, largely through KCC, systemics in family therapy in the proper system sense, that was very exciting, and it was very easy to pick it up and run with it, because I'd already been having fun with systems theory.
What were some of the questions? What were some of the questions or theories that were good joining and extending theories from your point of view that found their way into clinic practice at that point?
Yeah. I think UK family therapy as a whole was having a systemic frame, and just the whole idea of the family as a system, and with systemic rules, again, from the 70s, systemic people saying all interconnected systems have similar characteristics or basic characteristics that are the same. But that's why there was actually at that time quite an emphasis on homeostasis, because complex systems work to remain stable in a dynamic way. And it was very attractive to see families as a dynamic system trying to maintain homeostasis. That became unfashionable. But it actually, I think there's still something in that. When you look at dysfunctional families, there's a lot of processes that are working so that it doesn't blow apart. There's a basic question to ask families when they first come, which is, how come you haven't killed each other yet? I never did ask that question. But
you didn't include that question in the score then?
No.
So there was something about systems, and I think, I just want to keep mapping some things in terms of time. Some people think artificial intelligence is something that's only just emerged in the last while, but there was a huge interest, particularly from psychology and engineering and so on, in artificial intelligence, AI as it was known then, in the 70s. Possibly earlier, but it was a really big thing.
I was at Gordon Pask at Brudner was doing a lot of work on that. I think he's still alive, actually, he's still going. But there were quite legendary people trying to do systemics of human behavior, but of individual humans, of brains, and so on.
What was it about the systemic community in England and Europe, between Europe and the States, and later Australia and New Zealand and so on, that moved you? Was there something more than just the kind of co-creation of theory and practice?
The people were fun and exciting. There's no question. It brought, and again, I credit KCC with a lot of that to start with, that he would have Maturana come to a conference, or Minuchin, or these legendary figures. The family therapy conferences were exciting, and the systems was a coordinating thing. I mean, John Burnham was very significant in this. I remember that must have been around about 83, when the AFT was meeting in York, and he was talking about Bateson, and demanding to know which of us had read which papers by Bateson in his presentation. So it was it was very exciting, actually, because it brought people from all kinds of different contexts together with a shared agenda, really, of making systems work.
What
And
did you do in Leeds then? Once you'd broken, broken through a wall to make a family therapy suite, what were you doing there then? Were you seeing families? Where did you have training teams? Did you have any visitors or guests?
yes, I mean, largely, yeah, we were self-invented, and that was in 1979. We started the clinic. It was bootstrapping. I mean, well, it's quite. I had trouble joining EFTA because I never actually did a training course. There wasn't one.
How it's really funny to think of the central role you've had in EFTA, in training, in developing research, in particular systemic research. But okay, carry on. So, but in terms of the clinic, what happened? Well, who was there? Who were some of the people in the early team with you?
Um, well, Helga, obviously, and we set it up jointly between us. Me, because I had the screen, really, and one of the
When did you and Helga get together?
um, officially at the end of '79.
We'll go with officially. End of
Yeah,
79, a
yeah.
very particular moment in the development of family therapy. And I'm looking forward to talking with Helga in a systemic lives conversation as well at some point. But the two of you set up the clinic together, and then who else was involved?
There were four clinical psychologists who were mostly in Helga's year in the training course earlier in the '70s, and had the idea that working with families made a lot more sense than just working with individuals, at least sometimes, and wanted to explore it. It was a new, exciting thing, family therapy in the '70s, after all.
Yeah.
And I mean, one of the team, the one I was trying, whose name I will remember in a few minutes, had done his PhD on rats in Hull University, and is now a training analyst in West Yorkshire, Vic Sedlak. I mean, he was one of the clinical psychologists that thought working with families was a good idea, and then he went off and trained in the Tavistock in psychoanalysis.
You know, a few weeks ago, was it months? Was it weeks? There was a wonderful evening um, uh, with you and Helga Hanks and Kate Stewart and Larry Anderson. Is that right?
Yes,
To
yes.
talk about, interviewed by Colin Waterman, to talk about the history of the Leeds Family Therapy and Research Centre. And um, they were involved. Actually, Michael Preston Shute was there in the audience. He'd also at some point passed through that centre. And it sounded like there were many stories of people who'd visited. I think of when I hear, I was training in family therapy in different kind of ways from the late '70s onwards, but not in that kind of way where I was attached to a centre. And I feel like I missed out on a lot of the socializing. Though it seems to me that systemic therapy, frankly, was fueled on alcohol at that time. Is that true?
Oh, yeah, I think so. That was culturally essential. I just want to add, Kate and Larry ran family therapy in child guidance in Shipley. Um, so he was, and Larry particularly, he had an amazing library of systemics in his home. Um, so I was very jealous of. So we jointly worked with them. They were one of the influences, and we had joint sessions between Shipley Child Guidance and
So just let's list some of the developments that came out of LFTRC, because there was the clinic, there was the research, there were the training programs from introductory right through to masters. There was different kinds of research going on, from of things to do with families. And then there was the development of SCORE. But also, we mustn't forget that out of the Leeds hub ran Huamn Systems in conjunction, the journal, Huamn Systems Journal of Consultation, Systemic Consultation and Management, with KCC London. And, um, and that was something pretty much, let's face it, that you produced, that you and Helga produced. And KCC trainees and Leeds trainees all fed into the writing. It was an amazing in-house journal, now to be found at apparently, well, there are different versions of it, but if you look at humansystemsjournals.com, you'll find all the back issues of that journal there. Amazing papers.
Yes.
And they didn't get submitted out the blue, did they? This was
a
lot of conversations, a lot of meetings, a lot of touting. I want to know, as a journal editor, as an ex-journal editor, I want to know what was the magic in the letter, or was it over that glass of wine? How did you get people to submit papers, or were people writing more in those days? I don't know if anybody writes anymore.
I don't know about that. I do think a lot of it was Peter, who had an amazing array of contacts. But and of course John Burnham was very much part of KCC, so his approach, method, technique paper, which is still used, and somehow Barry Mason and his safe uncertainty. I mean, there were papers in Huamn Systems that are still very significant today, which is unusual. Most old papers get discarded on ageist grounds, but Huamn Systems, I think it was exciting, and at the time, Journal of Family Therapy wasn't exciting, and if you chase, as a journal, if you chase citations, research papers are much better for generating citations because other people do similar research and cross-reference, whereas really good clinical material and good theoretical material doesn't get. So the journal doesn't get the prestige of a high citation index. That seems to be a dynamic around. Although Journal of Family Therapy got a lot better and now is having trouble getting enough research in because everybody's writing clinical stuff for it. Things change. So I think Huamn Systems really was, the way we ran it, was quite exciting in those days. Progressively, access to other journals, so Family Process, American Journal, Family Therapy, became much more available and became competition. So I think Huamn Systems did run into there being a lot more competition, but also Peter was very resistant to taking it to a publisher because he had a dream that it would become highly financially productive and would help to fund KCC.
Oh, wow. I have such a different idea. I'm absolutely resistant to the idea of Murmurations Journal of Transformative Systemic Practice being attached to any. So I support the idea of independence, but with a view to it not generating income, because the moment it gets attached to a publisher, you get behind a paywall and people can't access unless they pay. They can't access the papers unless they pay and remember their passwords and all the rest of it.
I think it's one, I hadn't planned that, but I wrote a paper on schemas as a basis of thinking, drawing in stuff from my past about models or the brain. I wrote an essay of the brain as a model of the universe. That it should be the mind as a model of the universe. So how the human cognitive and emotional system maps the bits of the universe that are relevant to us, and developing a whole set of ideas about schemas in a very small sense. I'm not talking about gender schemas and stuff, but when an input comes in several times a second, that it produces a flurry of potential schemas, most of which fade out, and one or two remain in consciousness. And there's a whole theory around dreaming is actually just the same process. It's just it doesn't get damped down, so it does spark off in all kinds of interesting directions, whereas we stay with the boring, useful one. So yeah, I enjoyed writing that.
That sounds really good. Again, presumably it's on ResearchGate. Yes, it's on ResearchGate for anybody who wants to follow up and read that. Let's talk about SCORE for a minute. I know you can talk about SCORE because there's so much to say and so many versions of SCORE now, but we're going to do this briefly so that we don't lose people's attention. So what is SCORE?
Okay, SCORE is attempting to be a measure of the quality of interaction within families or in relationships. Relationships now, because we're working on a version for couples. It, rather than having people evaluate, we don't have questions like, do you think your relationship is going well? We try to get really quite concrete, as we would in therapy. When's the last time that happened in therapy is the kind of orientation. So we're attempting to be as concrete as we can, but having questions that would be relevant to all families. So we can't assume they've got children in SCORE, because some do, some don't.
How did SCORE come about?
We were politically fighting against IAP or against CBT as the answer to everything that IAP needed when it was introduced. So there was that, and a group of us got together. Julia Bland in the Institute of Psychiatry, she was a psychiatrist there, I think was a prime mover, and we had been trying in Leeds to develop measures. So we got a group together and we met in the Institute of Psychiatry. I tracked down regularly. Chris Evans was part of the group, which was very useful because he developed the CORE, which is meant to be a universal measure of
Let's just talk about what these letters mean. So CORE, which is widely rolled out across particularly the counselling profession and increasingly psychotherapy professions. What does it stand for? Clinical Outcome and Research Evaluation?
Routine evaluation.
Routine evaluation, I'd forgotten that.
It's a big deal at the moment. Someone just did some research. Only 14% of family therapists routinely record anything. 14%.
Record anything or record research?
Well, record data, yeah.
Okay, date research, sort of, yeah. And so SCORE has got the systemic in front of it.
Okay, this is my dysfunctional sense of humour. In the meetings, we were talking about it in its relation to CORE. So I said, well, we could call it systemic CORE, SCORE. That's a good name for a measure. It's a disastrous name for a measure, of course, because you get talking about people's scores on SCORE and you don't know which score you're
okay.
bothered about. But anyway, it's SCORE. You can't change it.
The point is, it's a research tool. It's a way of evaluating and practice, coming up with some evidence to support practice. By the time there was a crisis across counseling and psychotherapy modalities, some modalities like CBT were way ahead of the game. In fact, they were leading the culture of evidence base in order to have a lead role in the field as the dominant form of psychotherapy or whatever treatment. And the other psychotherapies were almost quite happy with anecdotally based evidence. And you were able to get SCORE activated in a way across the community so that clinics, individuals, institutes could start not only using it but teaching it, so that people would use it in different ways, whether with different client groups, in shorter versions, longer versions, and so on, and support their own services, the delivery of systemic within wider organizations. It was a massive thing. And some modalities literally went off the grid and weren't funded anymore because they couldn't provide an evidence base. So that's why I think it's very important to acknowledge your work and that of your colleagues, Julia Bland and others. There have been others as well, I know, who've helped with the development and writing up of SCORE. So thank you for that on behalf of the rest of us. Especially those like me, more involved in qualitative research. Thank you for that.
Well, if you go on to AFT, click on research, and then the SCORE, including the 32 countries that are now using it with translated versions.
And I suppose, you've, not only in terms of early family therapy, in terms of, you mentioned Murmurations earlier, I'm sure you're familiar with, Haley and Whitaker and Satir and Ackerman and many, many people, but also then into the development of Milan. And then all those strange things that happened in critiquing Milan. We could talk about the influence of the observer and the impossibility of neutrality and becoming a participant observer, and then the shift into collaborative dialogic. I mean, you've and the development of postmodern critique of expertise, and of course back to your learning early about the theory of knowledge and what then happened around theorizing knowledge with social construction, which is a kind of theory of theories. So I'm thinking you've really not just moved in a linear chronological way with the development of theories that have been of interest to systemic and shaped systemic and systemic shaping of, but also you've moved sort of sideways between different disciplines and different activities. So I'm sort of wondering, what surfaces, when you sort of put all of that in a little bowl and pour water on it and see what grows, what is it that's been growing through all these changes?
Well, I think I need to say I felt somewhat dissociated from some of those changes. And I've remained loyal to systemics. And I think systemics sometimes gets rather lost in the exciting new bright idea, if I can be disparaging.
So which systemic ideas, Peter, do you think deserve or need to thrive?
I think there's an enormous amount of progress made in systemics. There's the American-based International Society for Systemic Sciences that are applying systemics, certainly ecologically, to climate change, to water and drought, all kinds of things. There's Okay, so and there's also systemics of organization, and I've written about this, about soft systems theory, for example, which is largely based in Hull now, was in Lancashire, Lancaster University, um, as an approach to organizational work, which could be used in family therapy. And I think family therapy, in its pursuit of postmodernism, if I can caricature it, has largely lost touch. And I was remembering when you said a paper, a significant paper, actually one that really got to me was the paper by O'Brien and Bruggen, Peter Bruggen, about if you're going to be a systemic therapist, apply it in every aspect of your life. Live systemically. I was quite shocked to read Tom Anderson saying before the reflecting team, the the team would talk quite disparagingly about the family behind the screen. We never did that. I thought that was appalling. We try to function systemically all the way through, and to use it much more broadly. So that's my bugbear, is we don't use the riches that are out there in systemics that have been developed in other areas to enrich systemic family therapy. We go off on a tangent with French philosophers.
Okay, I mean that's very interesting. I was in a seminar last night on internalized landscapes, which Lorna Edwards and I were hosting. And at some point, somebody was talking about Gregory Bateson's work, and Kate Creedy made a very interesting observation. She said about the kind of richness of Gregory Bateson's ideas. She said, with some passion, why we didn't get involved with ecology, I don't know. And it was something about that kind of broader use of systemic ideas and wider systems. So there's something about that we haven't yet, what's the word, explored sufficiently what systemic ideas can do both with families and beyond in terms of other forms of systems.
Yeah,
Um,
we should be out there. Yeah,
Out there where,
um, changing the world. Uh,
okay,
and certainly, actually, I just examined a PhD by Hugh Palmer et al., who
oh
ended
yes.
up with his work on Bateson's issues around climate change and ecology, and quoting Bateson saying, if we don't change our understanding of how to relate, our chances of survival as a species are less than a snowball in hell, were the words that he used, and we've ignored it. Yeah,
What do we need to do as systemic professionals?
we need to get out there and use the credibility that systemics gives us to influence others. We can't tackle climate change within systemic therapy, but we can get out there. You know, we did. I went with Barbara Warner to, we lobbied in, must have been 2008, 2009, politicians, particularly Labour politicians, unfortunately, because they all lost their jobs immediately after we'd convinced them that they needed to take on systemic family issues. But we had a phase, and it is a problem, I think, with AFT. It's a problem that AFT recognises, and that the BPS recognises, for that matter, and EFTA, that we're not out there lobbying the world, the politicians, the others with power, the industries, to take a more systemic view of just what the hell they're doing.
You're making a case for systemically trained therapists, not just thinking about themselves as doing this work within the clinic room,
I
but
am.
or with human systems or with family systems. You're making a case for applying system and elaborating on systemic theory and practice in other contexts. Is that correct?
Yeah. Well, human systems is wide enough. It's the human, but not just the middle of the of Bronfenbrenner circles. We need to get out into the wider circles, the community, and so on. Yeah.
So I'm jumping now beyond your ideas about systemic practice, but I'm interested in how do you think, what's the kind of reflexive relationship between how your work's influenced your life and how your life has influenced your work?
I think there's far more scope to live a systemic life than I've managed. And I think it'll go on being far more scope than anybody manages, really. But it's an aspiration, and it does direct you to thinking in wider influences, wider circles, the wider context that your own family operates in, and so on. But you, like GPs don't treat their own family, I don't think you attempt systemic interventions with your own children directly.
And what's the thing you're most proud of in terms of your professional achievements?
I think Huamn Systems was a major achievement. I think SCORE is a major achievement, actually, and they weren't achievements just by me. I mean, Huamn Systems grew out of Peter Lang sending me and Barnett Pearce down to a pub to create a journal.
I love it.
So,
oh, that's so beautiful. What did you drink? Do you remember?
No.
What did you eat?
Oh, some very inadequate. The conference back up the road was having a sumptuous lunch. We had a bag of crisps, I think, and half a pint of beer. But I've forgiven them for that.
But I think that's right. Huamn Systems, Journal of Systemic Management and Consultation, and the SCORE in its many forms, multiply translated into 32 different languages, and the training and the savers, I'd add saving the profession. But also, I think you're also known for your graciousness and diplomacy and persistence, as well as your creativity and wry experimental perspectives and thinking. What's the one, how do you want to be remembered in the systemic field?
I would like, it's a kind of altruist, I would like the things that I think are important to carry on and be developed and advanced. I mean, one thing we haven't said about SCORE is large numbers of therapists find it really useful to discuss with the families at the first session, because it orients them to family processes rather than whose fault something is. And I think that's a serendipitous achievement. Actually, we didn't have that in mind, but it's actually turned out to be valuable for a lot of people.
I'm really glad that you came out to play. Thank you. And thank you not only for this conversation, but I really mean this in a heartfelt way. Thank you for all your contributions that you've made to the field, our professional systemic practices, but also to the knowledge bases, and to just being daring and encouraging creative thinking and creative practice, encouraging needed responses, to think outside the box and even inside the box and think, what do we need to do next? I love the invitation, encouragement to take systemic into wider contexts. That I feel is very authorizing, very encouraging. But thank you for this conversation, Peter, and I look forward to seeing you and Helga in person another point soon.
Great. Thank you very much, Gail. It was a great, it was good fun.
Oh, good.